a lot of things that we said yesterday that we will no longer do today, but how many of you know that we're still doing it? Because we're in a holding pattern. Have you ever been in a holding pattern to the fact that you know you weren't going to go to that place anymore? But by the end of next week, you not only have been to that place one more time, but you have been to that place 3 more times. Have you ever been in a holding pattern? Have you ever been to where you told God, you said, God, I'm not going to do this anymore, but you end up doing it a little later? Have you ever been to the point where you say, God, I'm not going to talk like that anymore? But before you know it, you were right back in the same mode that you were before. Have you ever been to the point where you told God, God, I'm not going to walk the same way, because I know walking the same way is going to have me to end up in a bad situation. But before you can get home, you are already in the same situation. That's because we're simply in a holding pattern. And when you're in a holding pattern, how many of you know that bondage is hard to break? You see, a lot of times when we're in a holding pattern, we're trying to get out of there ourselves. But how many of you know that it is not up to you to break your holding pattern? Come on. And so many times we talk to friends about when we're in our holding patterns. We go to a friend because we think they know more than God. So we show up at them, or we text them, or we call them and say, hey, can we meet? Can we talk about a few things? Because we think that they know more than God. And so we want to meet with them so that they can tell us how to get out of our holding pattern. But they can't tell you how to get out of your holding pattern because they're in their own holding pattern. And so if they can't get out of their own holding pattern, how in the world it is that you think that they're going to be able to help you in your holding pattern? We're in a holding pattern, Johnny. You know, we talk about things that we're not going to do anymore. And so therefore, Kevin, we end up, Kevin, going crazy, going cuckoo, right? Because we're trying to figure out what it is and why it is that we continue to do the same things that we said that we were no longer going to do. Come on, Paul. You see, when I look at the text in Deuteronomy today, the Israelites had already been exited from Egypt. And so they were on the way to something good. They were on the way to the promised land. Don't you know you can be on the way to the promised land and still end up in a holding pattern? That's right. Come on, man. Here they were, they hanging out with Moses, the man of God. He's leading them to the promised land. And then it talks about in Exodus that they began to have a Red Sea experience. Have you ever had a Red Sea experience to where your back was up against the wall and people were still pressing you from this way? They pressing you from that way. They're pressing you from this way. And you're trying to figure out how you're going to get away, but you cannot move because you're having a Red Sea experience. Well, as we know in the text, in Exodus, it talks about the fact that the people were so afraid because they was facing the Red Sea and they had nowhere else to go. And Pharaoh's army was approaching them. And so they trying to figure out, what do I do next? Because they were certainly in a holding pattern. And so we know what happens next. We know what happened next because God opened up the Red Sea so that they can go through, and that took care of their Red Sea experience. But how many of you know that just as soon